Welcome to SSI Meetup. Today we have with us Daniel Hardman. He has been with us like almost a year ago with one of our first initial sessions. So it's a pleasure to have Daniel back. And he will be talking about a subject that is very dear to him and also very important in the identity space, which is the whole, what he called, which is a term I didn't know about before, which is Indirect Identity Control, which is about delegation, guardianship, which is a big subject, and controllership. So let us quickly review together in slide number 2 what SSI Meetup is about. And basically what we're trying to achieve together is to empower global SSI communities. And this is open to everyone. And with open to everyone, we mean it can be companies, individuals, or communities. Anyone can use this material because all this material is used with the shared with the Creative Commons by share alike license, which basically means it's open source and you can reuse it in whatever way you want around the world. We will be sharing this material in the Google slide deck so you can play with the slides. We will share the video, we will share a slide share presentation too. The only thing you have to do is to give credit back to Daniel in this case, who's sharing this material today, and to SSI Meetup. If you have any questions during the presentation, please just use the question tool. If the question is relevant for the moment when it's being made, I'll bring it up to Daniel. If not, we will share all those questions at the end of the presentation. And please ask all the questions you want, because since you're joining live, this is the best opportunity to talk to experts like Daniel and learn directly with them and bring up any thoughts you have or anything you need to know. So Daniel, thank you for joining us today. It's a pleasure to have you with us, and I really look forward to learn about indirect identity control.
Thank you. I've got a number of things that I'm going to share, and I thought that at the beginning I would just tell you where some of my material is coming from and encourage you to find out more about this material by going to those original sources if you'd like. I will have a slide that I'll end on that has these same links on it, so you don't need to desperately scramble to catch this right now. But I just want you to know there's more material behind what I'm presenting today. And in some ways, I'm acting partly as a representative of a group of very smart people at the Sovereign Guardianship Task Force. This includes some technical people, a number of business people, NGOs, and people affiliated with them, and a number of legal minds that have thought through some of the implications of the topic that I'm going to share with you. And so to some extent, this is not my original work here. All of the problems and gaps in the presentation are probably mine, but all of the good thinking is should be attributable much to them. I hope you see this as part of a larger movement and not just Daniel talking about a particular topic. So with that, let me jump right in. The Sovereign Glossary tackles the issue of indirect identity control. And what this means is phenomena where you have an identity, and of course it belongs to a particular person, and belongs should be in air quotes because how you model belonging or ownership of identity has some subtle questions to it in legal terms. But anyway, how you model those kinds of identity relationships needs to take into account the possibility that sometimes an identity is managed by somebody else in some way. And there's three basic categories of this identity management that the Sovereign Glossary talks about. One of them is delegation. This is where one party says to another, please do this part of my work and represent me in this particular way. And a simple example of delegation is all of us probably are familiar with the process that is used to buy a house, and we expect to engage a realtor to represent us. And that's an act of delegation. The realtor can carry on certain kinds of interactions on our behalf. Then there's guardianship, and guardianship is a little bit different because the guardian and the dependent don't have an equal relationship. A dependent has the name dependent because they do depend on the guardian to do certain things for them in a way that they could not do for themselves. And a classic example of this is children and parents. And then there is a controller phenomenon that is also a little different, and this is where the party that owns the identity isn't the party that actually makes the decisions. And that's a little different than guardianship, which has legal characteristics to it. If you think about the owner of a self-driving car or the owner of a pet, you're thinking about controllership kinds of things. And a year ago, when discussions were being had on this topic, this distinction between these three different types of indirect identity control was not very crisp. And so the writers of, or the creators of this glossary and the participants in the Guardianship Task Force created a matrix to help people understand exactly how these things are different. And I'm not going to go into deep details about this matrix, but I invite you to go study that if you want to understand the distinctions a little bit more carefully. All of these types of indirect identity control have many things in common, and we're going to get into what those commonalities are and how we actually model them and how we support the notion of SSI, self-sovereign identity, even in these cases where normal self-sovereignty is a little bit distorted by the circumstances. So just to give you a single crisp example of each one, delegation is something that you could see very clearly when a corporation has a board of directors and it has executives and employees with multiple levels of delegated authority. And all of those employees are, in a sense, representing their company. But that doesn't mean that every employee of the company should have equal weight in the interactions or equal privileges in the interactions that they do on behalf of the company. The janitor of a company and the CEO of a company are both employees, but they have very different delegated responsibilities. So that's an example of delegation. An example of guardianship is the parent to child relationship, but also the opposite. If you have adult children who have a parent who perhaps is suffering from dementia, that is also a guardianship kind of a phenomenon. And an example of controllership could be a person that is in control of a self-driving car. And when I say in control here, I'm not talking about sitting at the steering wheel. I'm saying a person who's the owner that lets the self-driving car out for use by the public or something, but is legally responsible to maintain insurance and is the person you sue if you get in an accident with them and stuff like that. That would be the controller of the self-driving car. And likewise, the owner of a pet is probably best thought of as the controller of their identity. So let me stop here for just a minute and see if people have questions about kind of these three basic ideas and how to distinguish between them.
There are no questions right now, specifically, no.
Okay. Well, okay, I'll just go ahead then on the assumption that people are relatively comfortable with that distinction. So what I'd like to, well, first of all, let me mention that there's been formal work done on use cases for these situations as part of the Sovereign Guardianship Task Force. And there's a link here on this slide to a document where you can go read the formal definitions of many of the use cases I'm listing here. But I think the thing I'm hoping that you get out of this particular slide is just how many different things that are very reasonable, very familiar kinds of problems that we all have how many of those exist for which indirect identity control of one kind or another is an important part of the solution. We talk about self-sovereign identity, and the canonical case we imagine is an adult who has good access to technology, who understands the digital landscape and the concepts of self-sovereign identity, and who is capable of expressing their will and so forth. And that is kind of the sweet spot for self-sovereign identity. But we want self-sovereign identity to be able to provide benefits for a child. And a child can't make certain legal decisions. So how do we extend those benefits to a child? And how do we make sure that self-sovereign identity has something useful to add for the adult who has Alzheimer's? And how do we apply the concept of self-sovereign identity to a racehorse that clearly has an identity that needs to have credentials attached to it about their genealogy and whatever, yet cannot make decisions on their own? So that's why these use cases have been thought through carefully, and they're all very interesting. I encourage you to go study some more about them. So I'm going to talk for a minute about guardianship specifically. Now, delegation and controllership have unique characteristics, but I'm going to use guardianship because I think this is the one aspect of indirect identity control that has the most interesting legal entanglements and is the clearest and most familiar to all of us. At least it provides an easy way for me to bring up some interesting issues. So let me talk first of all about this particular phenomenon. Normally, when we think about self-sovereign identity, we think that most of the risk that has to be managed on the landscape comes from outside the self. So, we worry about hackers trying to interfere with what we're doing. We worry about privacy and people spying on us. Whatever those things are that we're worried about with self-sovereign identity, or even the more general phenomenon of decentralized identity, whatever those are, we normally think about them mostly as being external. But in the case of guardianship, you have a risk to the party in question that is in some sense internal. The relationship between a parent and a child is probably inside the firewall, so to speak. And so this kind of phenomenon requires us to think about some issues differently, or some issues in a new list of issues entirely from the ones that we're most familiar with when we talk about self-sovereign identity. And it also requires us to solve certain problems differently. Saying that we will protect ourselves with cryptography and cybersecurity measures is not going to help when we're talking about a risk that's internal. So that's an interesting way that it kind of bends our brains around the normal modes of operation that we usually assume. Another thing about guardianship that's interesting is when risk actually happens. In normal self-sovereign identity models, risk is kind of constant in some ways. Now, there's certainly moments when the risk is higher and lower, but at any time you could be hacked. But in the case of guardianship, there's some interesting key moments that require special attention. Some of them occur when a transition happens. So when you place a person under guardianship, there's a reason why doing that requires a court order in many legal jurisdictions. And it's because courts recognize that that is a moment of vulnerability. And so recognizing that those moments of vulnerability exist, that risk can be high, allows us to understand some new rules that we have to take into account in a self-sovereign identity model that supports guardianship. We need to be able to ask and answer questions like, should this transition be happening now? Are the right people involved? And have we met all of the conditions and limits and safeguards that are expected to be there? Another question that's interesting that we've never encountered until we start thinking about indirect identity control. How does the proxy, or in this case the guardian, for a dependent actually get appointed? And knowing how these people, how somebody gets a guardian status, and how multiple people who all have guardian status with respect to the same dependent should be evaluated with respect to each other is kind of a new question. So there's 4 ways basically that a guardian gets guardianship status. One is the dependent appoints them. So this could be a case for somebody who is a normal, healthy, connected, capable adult who says, yeah, I'm going into surgery, I'm going to be unconscious for an extended period of time, I appoint Alice to be my guardian while I'm in surgery. A legal authority can appoint a guardian as well. The last 2 may be a little bit less obvious, but are also worth understanding. A guardian can appoint themselves. Now, if you're like me, you might be allergic to that statement. You might say, wait a minute, that's a terrible idea. It is a suboptimal situation, but it is also a reality. If you were a reporter visiting a war-torn country and you walked down a street where there was rubble and, you know, buildings falling over and excuse me, people were trying to pick themselves up and get to the nearest hospital, and you found a small child in the rubble who was semi-conscious, and you managed to pull them out. When you pulled them out of the rubble, guess who's their guardian? You are. There's no legal thing that made you the guardian, and the child didn't ask for you to be their guardian, but you're the best guardian that exists until a better one is found, and so you appoint yourself as the guardian. And that is a legitimate basis for guardianship. And lastly, there are circumstances that kind of create an implicit guardian. So nobody formally appoints most parents to be the guardian of their children. They simply are by nature of the circumstances. The same for pet ownership. Being a controller of a pet kind of comes automatically with being the owner of the pet. And it's important to recognize that these methods or these triggers do not carry equal trust. So obviously, having a self-appointed guardian is better than nothing, but if the parent of the little child that you pulled out of the rubble suddenly shows up, then the parent's status as a guardian trumps the the reporter's status as the guardian. And we all kind of recognize that intuitively, that there are stronger bases and weaker bases for being a guardian, and we have to distinguish between them. This is a phenomenon that is not at the fore of our minds when we're talking about normal self-sovereign identity. Let me make that even more crisp by giving you a scenario here. Suppose that a young child is in a refugee camp, and there is some dispute about who's the proper guardian. And the camp, the charitable organization that's running the camp, the NGO, says, well, I'm the guardian of Maya. I appointed myself because she wandered in out of the jungle. Then a man shows up and says, no, I'm really the guardian of Maya, and here's her birth certificate with my name on it. And then a woman says, no, I'm really the guardian of Maya, and here's her ration card with her photo on it. And lastly, a police officer or some representative of the government shows up and weighs into this conversation and says, no, Anna is really the guardian because the man's parental rights were terminated by a court order. So what I'm trying to show with this example is this can get messy. Normal self-sovereign identity, we say, who's in charge of the identity? Well, it's supposed to be the person whose identity it is. But here we've got a case where none of these people that we've listed that are claiming guardianship are necessarily claiming it with invalid evidence. But there is kind of a hierarchy of claims here, and human judgment is required to decide which is the best available alternative. So you can see that this phenomenon gets complicated. Guardians have to have limits placed on them. We kind of, if we're thinking about the simple case of a parent and a child, we may not think much about those limits and just say, well, a parent can do whatever they want. But that's not always necessarily true. Years ago, I was traveling with my son from Utah, which is a state in the western United States where I live, to Mexico. And as I made my travel arrangements, the airline said, okay, do you both have a passport? And I said, yes, both have a passport. And they said, okay, do you have a letter from your wife authorizing you to take your child across a national boundary? Because my son was pretty young at the time. I think he was 7 or 8. And I had never thought that I would need something like that, but the airline wanted to make sure that there was no dispute between the parents about this, and I wasn't trying to just take my son out of the country with, bad intentions or something. And so guardians have to have limits placed on them, and there's lots of different kinds of limits that we could imagine would make sense for guardians. We could make somebody a guardian for only a certain period of time. We could make them a guardian only in a certain place. We could say you're a guardian with respect to a particular function only. So you're like a legal guardian, but you're not a guardian in the context of education, or maybe you're a guardian for medical purposes only, but not for legal purposes or something like that. We could make somebody a guardian for particular events, like while you're traveling. Imagine a high school student goes on a exciting tour of Europe with some of their fellow students and a couple of teachers, and maybe those teachers are made guardians of the students in some limited sense while they're out of the country where they came from. You could place biometric limits on guardians. You could say, for example, you can only exercise your guardianship if you can prove that the dependent is actually present by scanning their hand or their iris or something. Anyway, you can see the long list here. There's a lot of different possible limits that might be desirable. And these, again, are different from the way that we think of normal identity working. So with all of this background that I've just given you about the guardianship problem, I'd like to share this quote with you. This comes from an RFC that is about these 3 forms of indirect identity control. And after kind of summarizing some characteristics, this observation is made. All of these forms of identity control share the issue of indirectness. All of them introduce risks beyond the ones that dominate indirect identity management, and all of them complicate information flows and behavior. And they are interrelated. Guardians and controllers often need to delegate. Delegates may become controllers, and so forth. The solution for each ought to have much in common too. So I think that what I'd like to do in this is kind of, I'm going to transition here from kind of describing a problem generally to describing a solution for all of these forms of indirect identity control. And I'm basing this pivot on this quote that these do have a lot in common, and we should think about them and the issues that they raise in kind of a disciplined fashion and have a methodical approach to how we manage them. So here are the elements of a solution to indirect identity control that I want to advocate. And by the way, I'm coming out of the Sovrin / Hyperledger Indy / Hyperledger Aries kind of an ecosystem. But everything that I've said so far and everything I'm going to say hereafter could be done in any identity ecosystem that is pursuing self-sovereign principles. They don't depend on any particular feature in any particular ecosystem. And so what I'm hoping is to establish a dialogue with anybody from whatever walk of life you're coming from. If you want to accomplish building an ecosystem that is safe and robust with respect to these phenomena of indirect identity control, I hope you pursue these principles no matter what credential technology or blockchain or whatever might be behind your world. So here are the three elements that I think are necessary in a solution.
Daniel, just one little question, because I think it's a comprehension question that might be useful for everyone else, that Fabio is asking. He's asking, the difference between guardianship and controllership can feel a little bit elusive. And then he asks, would it be correct to say that a controller-controlled relationship exists as opposed to a guardianship one when the controlled entity has no human-like legal status, and because of that it's also fully subject to the controller under all circumstances?
Yes, that's a good way of saying it. Let me go back to this matrix that I kind of skipped over here. If you look at this matrix and you think about the guardianship column and the controllership column, the very first cell on the top there's a yes and a no, and that's essentially what Fabio is highlighting. A controlled thing is not the kind of thing that's capable of having legal standing in the same way as a dependent in a guardianship relationship. So a pet or a self-driving car does not have the same kind of legal status as a human being. And it's true that you model the kind of relationship between, let's say, an adult and a pet versus an adult and a child. The adult is making sweeping decisions for both of those entities, but the child legally has a different treatment than the pet. Now, how different that legal treatment is could vary by jurisdiction. In some cases, maybe the pet has a lot of rights, and in other cases, maybe not very many. But in almost any legal jurisdiction I know of, the child is considered special as compared to the pet. And therefore, it falls into the guardianship category. The child is capable of having a self-sovereign, it's the kind of thing, I should say it that way, it's the kind of thing that's capable of having a self-sovereign identity, even if it currently doesn't have some because of current circumstances. Whereas the pet is the kind of thing that is completely incapable of having a self-sovereign identity, period. Does that help?
Yeah, I think so. If not, we can. Yeah, he's saying yes, it does. Awesome.
Okay, great. So this is a great question, and this is why this matrix was created, is because you're right, Fabio. There's some subtleties around this, and you see some asterisks here about different, do these parties control their own keys? No, with asterisks by it and stuff. There's some subtleties that are worth studying about this. So I encourage you to go read Appendix C of the Sovereign Glossary if you want to know more. Okay, let's see here. So the three basic elements that I think must exist in a solution to indirect identity control are these. First of all, a proxy trust framework. I'm using proxy here as a cover term for all three of the different indirect identity types here. So you need a trust framework that specifies the rules and conventions in force for a particular class of indirect identity control use cases. And I'm going to give you examples of all of these in my presentation. So if that sounds like a lot of big words, hopefully when you hear an example, it'll make more sense. But basically, you need the trust framework, then you need the concept of a proxy credential. And this is a way of saying informally, what are the privileges, duties, and responsibilities of this proxy with respect to the other thing that they're proxying. And lastly, you need the concept of a proxy challenge. And a proxy challenge is a formal interaction where you evaluate the proxy credential and the circumstances with respect to the trust framework. So in the case of the airline that once said to me, will you have a letter from your wife that authorizes you to take your son across a national border? That's a form, a very simple form of a proxy challenge. They're basically saying, tell us that everything is kosher here so that we know that we're not, enabling bad behavior. So those are the three elements. So let me talk about each of these now for a minute. First one, a trust framework. What is a trust framework? Some of you probably are very familiar with this term because it's been socialized in these circles quite a bit. But for those who haven't run into this before, a trust framework is basically a formally published document that defines a bunch of rules. And this is not necessarily an exhaustive list, but it's a pretty good list of the kinds of rules that have to be defined in the kind of trust framework I'm thinking of here. So, of course, the document has to give itself a name and a version, but more interestingly, it has to say, where is this legal, like in what geographies and legal jurisdictions? What are the required or recommended behaviors that should be observed by participants in the ecosystem? And there's different kinds of participants, right? There's in the case of guardianship, there would be the dependent, there would be the guardian themselves, or the controller, or the delegate, and then there would be the parties that are interacting with the proxy and what they should do and how they should behave. On what bases, that's this word bases here should be, that's the plural of basis. Maybe another word would be rationale. On what rationale are proxies appointed? And there could be different reasons why you would appoint a proxy. Well, I'm appointing this guardian because they have a kinship relationship with the child in question. Or I am the controller of this particular river. In New Zealand, there's a river that has legal rights, and there's somebody who is appointed to advocate for those legal rights of that river. I'm the official advocate for that river and its controller by court order, or I've been self-assigned as the guardian, or whatever. Knowing what those are is part of what a trust framework should answer. They should say, these are the possible ways that we recognize a proxy could come into their status. What are the possible permissions of a proxy? And what possible constraints can be placed on a proxy in our trust framework? What auditing mechanisms are required and supported? What appeal mechanisms? And what kinds of procedures should be used when somebody does the proxy challenge that I said was a key ingredient here? And lastly, what kinds of rules should be followed in terms of freshness of data for operating when you can't talk to the internet, stuff like that. So if that seems like an intimidating list of questions, it doesn't have to be. I provided an example here, and this example is, I would guess, maybe 2 printed pages long. It's part of the Aries RFC 103, which defines a lot of these concepts I've been talking about. And it's a sample trust framework that applies to guardianship in refugee camps. And you could come up with a different trust framework, perhaps a trust framework that's used for controllership of racehorses. There could be a trust framework about that, and it could define answers to all of these different questions. And you could, if it were about controllership of racehorses, you might, recognize the status of a jockey, the veterinarian that is a regular veterinarian of this particular horse, the owner, and they would have different rules and responsibilities and constraints placed on what they can do and so forth. And so each trust framework carves out a subset of use cases and says, here's the rules that we're going to follow with respect to these use cases. Any questions about that?
Nothing at the moment, no.
Okay. So I'm going to actually walk you through now a particular scenario, and I'm going to go back to guardianship to do it, but I'm going to try to give you a concrete example that puts these 3 ingredients together: the trust framework, the credential, and a proxy challenge. Now, I'm going to begin the scenario by assuming that the trust framework deals with guardianship at a refugee camp, and that in this particular circumstance that will follow, a little girl has wandered out of the jungle with her grandmother. They're holding hands together, and they walk up to the front gates of the camp and say, we would like to be taken in here. We don't have any other place to live and we need help. So imagine that scenario, and now imagine that a staff member at the camp has interviewed these 2 people, and maybe they've had a little medical check to make sure that they're okay and stuff like that. And the trust framework requires that anybody who's acting as a guardian for a child have some formal proof that they are the guardian. And that's a useful protection because the camp is filled with thousands of people that don't know each other, and it would be easy for a child to get lost or manipulated, somebody to steal their rations or something if there weren't good protections in place. And so the staff member at this camp, after interviewing these people, imagine that they have a piece of software, maybe it's running on a tablet or a laptop or a mobile device of some kind, and the software is presenting the staff member with a user interface that looks kind of like these 2 little rectangles that I'm showing here. So it's asking the staff member to provide a photo of the child who's going to be the dependent and fill out these questions. So they say, well, this child answers to the name Maya, and the child's gender is female, and the birth date of the child is approximately this, and here are some identifying marks so we can tell if it's really the right child. Maybe it could be more elaborate than this, but let's just assume it's kind of like this. And similarly, the guardian that we're going to recognize for this child is this woman, and we've taken a photo of her as well, and she answers to this name, and this is approximately her birth date, and here's some identifying marks that we could use to recognize her. So they've gathered this information, and now they're going to set in motion the the mechanism that this trust framework requires to make sure that the little girl is protected and the grandmother has the ability to operate as her guardian inside the camp. Okay, so once this data is collected, the next step would be to create an actual verifiable credential. And this credential's job, this is the proxy credential that I said was one of the 3 ingredients of a solution. This credential's job is to provide formal documentation about the relationship between the dependent and the guardian. If we were doing this and it was a controllership situation, then the credential's job would be providing formal documentation about the relationship between the thing that's being controlled, like the self-driving car, and the party that's doing the controlling, like the company that owns it or something. Okay, and what I'm showing here is a rough dump of the kind of information that would go in this credential. So the stuff that appears in kind of purple near the middle of the screen here, these are names of fields in the credential. Okay, and so the first field that it lists is the trust framework, and that's a URL that points to something that people can go look up to say, oh, this credential is operating under the rules specified at this URL. Okay, and the second property here is an audit URI. This says this is where oversight is located. This is where I should report concerns if I think something bad is happening. Parties that operate this URL are probably going to periodically ask for, you know, proof that I'm doing things the right way, whatever. So that there's an audit URI and there's an appeal URI, and that's so that you can point to some mechanism that would adjudicate problems. A little bit further down, we say, let's talk a little bit about the holder of this credential. Now, this particular credential is actually going to be held by UNICEF. UNICEF is the party in my imaginary example that's running the camp, and UNICEF is going to become a guardian of this little girl. Now, you might be saying, wait a minute, I thought the grandma was going to be the guardian. Yes, hold that thought. The grandma is also going to be a guardian, and that's my next slide. But the camp is going to be a guardian as well, and I'll explain why in a minute. So in this case, the basis for this particular holder being a guardian is given by this URL, which is a formal documentation of a self-appointed guardian basis, okay? And the role of this particular holder is camp, okay? So we're saying that UNICEF plays the role of camp in a guardianship trust framework, and that particular role, camp, is defined in the trust framework. Trust framework says, these are the duties of the camp, and these are the responsibilities, and these are the audit constraints that they have, and all these other things. The trust framework says camps operate the following way, and this piece of information, role camp, says the holder of this credential has the role of camp. And there's a name given to the holder of this credential, UNICEF. This particular holder doesn't have a birth date or a gender or any identifying marks or whatever. But this holder has some constraints on what they can do. One of the constraints is that they can only operate within the boundaries of the Lotus camp, if that was the name of a camp somewhere. So if somebody's trying to evaluate guardianship status and they see this credential and we're talking about something that happens far away from the Lotus camp, then it should be clear that this holder doesn't have any status anymore. And circumstances here, they're only a guardian until this little girl gets resettled somewhere. Then there is a section called proxied, which is where we say describe in this case we describe the little girl that is being proxied by this particular holder. Okay, so the first thing that we describe about this little girl is what permissions govern how this little girl is protected. And the permissions, there's a little blob of JSON here. They say grant the medical, school, and food privileges or permissions whenever the role of the holder of this credential is kin. What that means is if the guardian that we're talking to or interacting with is of type kin, and this one isn't, this is of type camp, but if they were of type kin, then that guardian would have privilege to control medical care, enroll the child in school, and get their food rations. Okay, that's the first rule. The second rule, grant the school, food, and delegate privilege when the role is camp. What this says is if the holder of this kind of credential is has the role of camp, then they are allowed to enroll the child in school, give her food, and delegate some of their privileges to their staff. Okay. And lastly, grant the unenroll privilege, that means take her out of the camp, and the travel privilege when, and this rule is a little bit more complicated. It says, when I have two parties that have either the two guardians that have either the role kin or the role camp. And what that means is grandma can't take this little girl out of the camp by herself. Neither can a staff member at the camp take the little girl out of the camp by herself. It takes two guardians agreeing together to unenroll this girl from the camp or to travel. So that's a protection to help the little girl be safe. It protects against various kinds of abuse. Now there's a photo of this girl, and you could imagine there could be other kinds of biometric identifiers besides a photo, fingerprint or something like that. And there's some more information about her. The name she answers to, which was collected in the previous slide here. There's answers to name Maya, shows up as her name over here. Her birth date, her gender, and the identifying marks that we collected about her. So all of this information is wrapped up in a classic verifiable credential. And this could be a sovereign style verifiable credential. That's the variant that I work with the most. It could be a JWT based credential that's conformant to the verifiable credential spec. It could be a JSON LD credential that's conformant to the verifiable credential spec. It doesn't matter what the type is, it matters whether it has this kind of information in it. Does anybody have questions about this?
No specific questions for this right now, no.
Okay, so I promised you that I would explain how grandma's credential works, and so so far I've shown you UNICEF's guardian credential. This makes UNICEF a guardian of Maya when she comes into the camp. But grandma also needs a credential, and grandma's credential looks very similar except for the parts I've highlighted here in yellow. So grandma's credential says that the basis for her being a guardian is not self-appointed. Rather, her basis is she's a grandparent, okay? And her role in the permission model is kin, not camp. So she has different privileges with respect to the guardianship that she exercises than the camp does. And it has identifying information about this person. The fact that she is named Zoe, that she has a birth date like this, that she is female, and that she has these identifying marks, and here's her photo. And you could put additional information in this credential as well, such as her fingerprint or other things that you felt were needed. But this is the kind of information that you would put here. Now notice she doesn't have any boundaries on her credential, which means she continues to be a guardian even when she's outside the camp. as opposed to UNICEF, which is only a guardian while she's there at the camp. And there are no circumstance constraints on Zoe either. Zoe is not limited in time to be a guardian only until resettlement. She's just a guardian, period. Everything else about this is the same as UNICEF's. So the permissions, it's just kind of shown here grayed out, but it's the same information about permissions in Zoe's credential as in UNICEF's. That's this stuff over here, these rules about granting and so forth. And it also has the same information about Maya in the credential. So now let's actually talk about how this gets used. You have these two credentials, and you have a trust framework, and all of the same stuff up here about the trust framework exists. So we've got two of our three characteristics of a solution. So now, how is this credential used, and how does that manifest the third characteristic of the solution that I talked about? Well, the answer is, in the camp, a proxy challenge is performed whenever the trust framework says that there's some need to know. This is let's say a semi-risky situation. We need to know whether everything is appropriate. So the first situation I'll describe here is maybe you're getting rations at the food tent, and maybe handing out rations at the food tent needs a little bit of security around it, because otherwise maybe somebody will show up and claim they're the older brother of this little girl and get her rations, and then the little girl shows up later and she's hungry and it wasn't really her older brother. So the trust framework has decided that for safety purposes, every time food is dispensed, we're going to issue a proxy challenge, a guardian challenge. Okay, so Maya walks into the food tent holding the hand of an older woman, and the party that's the staff member that's behind the counter there says, let me see if I should be giving out food for you. So they pull up a tablet and they see a screen that looks kind of like these two rectangles. And in this screen, their goal is to put green check marks by everything, because if they put green check marks by everything, that means they should give out the food. Okay. So they say to this older woman, are you this child's guardian? And she says yes. And they say, can you prove it? And she says yes, and she produces her credential. Now, how she produces her credential, there's various ways that this could be done. She could produce a paper or laminated credential of some kind that lets a QR code be looked up by a scanner. She could have been issued a very cheap Android phone when she got into the camp. Some camps are doing that now. But let's just assume that somehow she's able to share with the camp member proof of her guardianship status that's based in the credential we've already talked about. So when she shares that proof, the screen automatically populates these two rectangles. It says, okay, the guardian answers to the name Zoe. The gender of this guardian is female, and she should look like this. And it pulls out of her credential the photo, the name, and her gender, and puts it in this rectangle. Okay. And then it says, in this older woman's credential, it says, let's go get the information about the girl that she's supposed to be guarding. And so it pulls out the photo. This is coming from Zoe's credential. It's pulling Maya's photo. It's pulling the information about Maya's age and the fact that she answers to this name and that she's female. So the rectangles get populated, but the check marks don't get put there, and the user of this software, who'd be the staff member, has to say, okay, does this older woman really look like this? Yes. Okay, so I check this off. Is it really a woman? Yes. Does she answer to the name Zoe? So the staff member looks up and says, "What's your name?" And the woman says, "Zoe," and the staff member checks a box. Then, looking at the other rectangle, the staff member turns to the little girl and says, "And what's your name?" And the little girl says, "My name is Maya." Staff member checks a box there. Is she a female? Yes. Does she look like she's about 6? Yes. Does she look like this picture? The staff member says yes. Check, check, check. Okay, everything is appropriate. I'm going to go ahead and issue this. Now, there's a couple of grayed out checkboxes. The software has already looked up from the credential that Zoe had and evaluated those rules about what permissions are held by different guardians, and so has concluded that Zoe has the permission to get food and that there are no other constraints on how she operates. You notice these things that say show more ways to check. You could click that if you felt like, well, maybe this girl that I'm looking at isn't the same as the one in the picture, and then it could, for example, show the identifying marks and say, this girl has pierced ears. Does the girl that you're looking at have pierced ears? Or it could say, okay, this girl's fingerprint is on file. Do you want to scan her fingerprint? So you could do more things to check if needed, but that's a proxy challenge. Any questions about how that works?
All good.
Okay, so you could do another proxy challenge where the stakes are a little bit higher. Now, let's say a woman shows up at the gates of the camp and says, I would like to take my granddaughter outside the gates. And you know, the risk of abuse here is high if this child is not really being protected by this adult who purports to be her guardian. So maybe the challenge that happens here includes all the things that we talked about before, but some things don't seem quite right because the girl in the picture resembles this girl in the other picture, but she's not quite, doesn't quite look exactly the same. And so the staff member at the gate could say, what is your name? And this girl could say, my name is Maya, and the staff member scratches their head and says, wait a minute, the credential I'm looking at says that this guardian is the guardian of a girl named Ree. That's not the same girl, or maybe I need to check a little bit more, and they can open this up and check more. There's another thing that happens down here, and that is the permissions section of the credential is evaluated, and the staff member says, wait a minute, you only have permission to do travel with your dependent if you're acting jointly with another guardian who has the role of camp. So I need to get another guardian to authorize this particular action. So they click add guardian and go find another guardian to authorize this as a joint operation. Does that additional proxy challenge make sense? Okay, I'm going to assume yes. Let me go on here, and at this point I have, this is my slide that I promised you where I would, you know, give you the URLs that were shown at the beginning, and you could copy them down. If you want to screenshot this slide or get the slides later from ssimeetup.org, you can do that and find more information. All of the stuff that I've talked about so far is part of the materials that are listed here. Aries RFC 103 describes it. Appendix C, the Sovereign Glossary. The meeting page for the Sovereign Guardianship Task Force has lots of information. And you're welcome to reach out to me directly. Now, I have a number of additional slides, but I figured this was about as far as we would get in our hour. So let me just flick through my slides briefly so you can see what's beyond this in an appendix. And then you can ask questions and we can see if people have an appetite to learn more. But just so that you're aware of other stuff is out there. Transparent versus opaque guardians is an interesting topic. And by the way, everywhere that you see guardianship, you could probably substitute delegate or controller, and a lot of the same principles apply, and there's more discussion about those. Modes of guardianship, you can base your guardianship you can do your guardianship in a mode where you're holding credentials, but you don't have any DIDs or link secret or anything like that. You can impersonate the party that you're guarding, and there's reasons why that's a bad idea, but there's also some reasons why sometimes it is necessary. And you can have what's called document-based guardianship. There's more information about each of these. In doc-based guardianship, for example, you put a little statement in your DID document that says, whenever you want to know whether this party can do something, challenge them, do a proxy challenge, and have them produce a credential. There's the notion of how guardianship is related to delegation, and how you can cross those boundaries, how you work in offline mode, how you revoke guardianship, basis for things besides guardianship, what's the basis for controllership and the basis for delegation, how delegatable credentials work, and so forth. So those are some things in the appendix. What additional questions do people have?
Yeah, we have a couple here. Let me bring them up, just one sec. Okay, so okay, I mean, first of all, Peter, he's saying, thank you so much, Daniel, this is amazing. He has a couple of comments. One is about, he's saying that in the European Union, pets need a chip. So I think this was when you mentioned that pets don't have an, I don't know if you said they don't have an identity. I think you said they're not self-sovereign. So I think he mentioned that in that context, if you want to comment that.
You're saying that pets don't need a what?
I think you said. I think he brought it up when when you said that pets are not self-sovereign.
Yeah.
And he was commenting that in the European Union they have a chip for pets.
Oh, a chip. Yes, a chip. Yeah, that was the word I was missing. Yeah. So you know, different places, different legal jurisdictions are going to model pets differently. And I tried to also bring up the notion of a racehorse. Animals aren't always pets, but they still might need some kind of controller or guardian. And we probably would not be quite as comfortable with the notion of putting a chip in a child, but with a pet, you don't have the same privacy concerns. So that's another reason why controllership, privacy and guardianship are interestingly entangled, but privacy and controllership are a little different.
Okay, yeah, and he's also adding it's only for traveling pets in the EU. So I think it's just as a side note. So yeah, that might be interesting. Charles is asking, what real-world projects do you believe might first implement guardianship?
Okay, I'm really glad you asked that question. There are a number of projects that are actively doing stuff with this information right now. So I don't know if Peter is Peter Simpson or some other Peter, but Peter Simpson is a member of the Guardianship Task Force who's been exploring the refugee use case that we kind of profiled here, and has been working on the ID 2020 initiative that the United Nations kicked off a while back. And so he's very interested in that and has real world projects that are implementing this right now. There are people who are doing, there's a pet controllership framework that's being written right now. And that's a very interesting subject. And there is also work happening on IoT devices and controllership there. And lastly, there is a company called Secures that is doing some very interesting things to help law enforcement. One of their use cases is you go running in the mountains and you don't show up when you're supposed to come back, and how do you get law enforcement involved? Can you release information to law enforcement in an automated fashion when a certain trigger happens that will give law enforcement your whereabouts? And if you're doing that, what constraints exist on the company so that they don't abuse that idea? All of that, there's a whole trust framework that needs to be written around that kind of a use case. And it's actually also being used for the use case of an adult with dementia. How do you protect that adult? So these are like real, not theoretical use cases, but people are building systems with all of these characteristics right now.
Cool. Peter is also asking, and it's not Peter Simpson, if you can detail how companies would be able to use this.
Okay, I could interpret that a few different ways. If you're talking about how a company could use delegation to give privileges to its employees, that's one interpretation of your question. Or if you're talking about how companies could be built around servicing a use case like guardianship or whatever, that might be a whole different question. So I'm not sure which way you mean it.
Maybe we take up another one and we give Peter time to specify it, okay?
Okay.
Then we have Fabio asking, these examples seem to assume that both the guardian and the dependent are available at the same time, or at least verifiable for both credentials. Is this always the case? How are privacy matters dealt with in proxy relationships?
That is a fabulous question, and it goes right to the heart of some of the issues that certain trust frameworks are wrestling right now. So in the refugee camp use case that I said is being built, they have a biometric freshness constraint. Basically, they don't want to allow, let's say, a staff member at the camp to do something without the party under guardianship being physically present, because there's a number of abuses that could happen. And so they have a constraint that you must have proved that the dependent is physically present using biometrics within a certain time threshold. And I think certain circumstances, the threshold is different. Like to enroll somebody in school, you have to prove it within the last 15 minutes. To take them out of camp, you have to prove it in the last 30 seconds, something like that. But in other cases, there could be trust frameworks where there is no such requirement. So for example, in the Secures use case where they're worried about a person who's lost in the mountains when they went on a run, the guardian is operating without the dependent being physically present. And their trust framework says that that's a perfectly legitimate thing to do, and it has different mechanisms that they've put in place to prevent abuse. Like in their particular case, when you went on a run, you had to have already appointed your guardian and specified the rules under which they operate and their constraints, and gone to whatever lengths you felt were appropriate to prevent abuse. So it's not the case that you always have to have both the guardian and the dependent physically present. It's just the case that the trust framework has to specify.
Thanks. Okay, so Peter, he specified this a little bit more. So he was asking, can you please describe the use for companies? And then he was saying companies with delegations and rights like hospitals.
Yes. Okay, great. So what you want in that particular situation is you want the company to issue a credential to their employee, and the credential should specify what privileges their employee has. So let's take the case of access to a particular lab in the hospital. There are probably a certain subset of people who work for the hospital that should be able to go into a lab. And it probably doesn't include the front desk receptionist, but it probably does include, you know, a pathologist who works in the lab on a regular basis. So each employee of the company would have instead of a guardianship credential, it would now be a delegate credential. And that credential would say the role of this party is, for example, lab worker, or the role of this party is janitor, or the role of this party is front desk reception, or whatever. And then you could have either an automated system or a human being at the door of the lab that challenges the party to produce their credential and says, okay, I'm looking at this party's credential and I'm seeing that they do or do not have the privilege that lets them come into the lab. So it's the same general principle here. It's not about doing something different. It looks almost like guardianship. Now, there's one wrinkle with delegation, and that is transitive delegation. So let's say that you delegate to a pathologist the privilege of being in this particular lab. Now the pathologist on a given day, let's say, is stuck in a meeting and they want to send their assistant down into this lab to get some data. And normally the assistant doesn't have the right to go into this lab. Their credential doesn't give them that privilege. But the pathologist can pull out a piece of software, their little app that holds their credentials, and say, I need to do a temporary delegation. And basically, they delegate the one privilege that's relevant. And this is just a one or two button clicks kind of a thing for the pathologist. And the assistant gets a temporary credential that shows up on their mobile device. And they walk down to the lab and present it, and the mobile device says, I see that you've been delegated a privilege by somebody who holds the privilege to enter the lab. Therefore, I will let you in. Now, whether or not delegation is possible is part of the trust framework to decide. But in this particular case, I'm just assuming it is. So you can see how a company could use this to delegate votes to their board of directors. They could use it to delegate the privilege to issue employment credentials to their HR department. They could use it to delegate privileges to issue press releases to their marketing department. Whatever they want to do. It's the same general principle that applies.
Nice. I have still a couple of questions here. So Reeks is asking, this is great stuff. However, it sets a fairly high demand on entities dealing with these issues to be able to define many different trust frameworks. How far is the task force on providing some examples or guidance on those?
Yeah, I share that concern, Reeks. I don't think that that everybody should have to spend a lot of time designing trust frameworks. This is a relatively new, immature space, and so there's not an inventory of trust frameworks that you can draw from today. There is one example in the ARES RFC 103. It's the example of the refugee camp trust framework that I used to kind of narrate this presentation. There are other ones that are being written. The guys that are writing the one for Secures, I think would be willing to share that publicly to some extent. I know that the folks that are doing the PET controllership framework have published some things about it. And so my guess is that in 6 months or a year, there will be a moderately good inventory of examples to reference. In the meantime, I'm happy to help somebody develop one of those. Like I said, the example when it's about a 2-page written document, it doesn't have to be overly intimidating to write such a thing. And anybody who's interested can contact me and I'll help them. But I do think there is a little bit of a lift right now for organizations because these trust frameworks don't exist. I'm just hoping that it will go away as people get a little bit more familiar with the problem space.
Great, thank you, Daniel. There's a question from Alan. Alan is asking, to what degree has the notion of updates to trust frameworks been thought through? Would all credentials need to be updated after each iteration to a trust framework?
That is a fabulous question. Boy, you guys are smart. So one of the requirements on one of the slides earlier on, I said a trust framework needs to give a formal name for itself and a version. And versioning a trust framework is important. Now, in the link, let's see, if I go back to a credential here, you'll notice that the hyperlink to the credential includes the trust framework's version 1.0. And there are some things that you could imagine changing about a trust framework that would not require reissuance of credentials. For example, maybe the trust framework says, we've added a new way to appeal. All of our existing credentials can keep using the way they have, but we've just added a new way of appealing, and new credentials are going to mention that new way. So that would be an example of a non-breaking change to a trust framework, and I would expect that to cause the version number to go from 1.0 to 1.1 or something. But if you had a major version change to the trust framework, that would probably mean that something about the rules has caused everything to be reevaluated, and 1.0 credentials would not be compatible with a 2.0 framework. So this is one of the things that the trust framework itself has to say is, here are some things that it's safe to change and we can imagine changing, and here are some things which, if they do change, will cause us to have to reissue credentials. I think most of the time, reissuance will not be necessary if a trust framework has been thought through at least moderately well. But if a trust framework is too sloppy, then it's possible that you would have to reissue things.
Nice, thank you. Another question from Fabio. He's saying, awesome, thanks for everything. Time is over, but it would be great if you could briefly elaborate on privacy matters and in regard to proxy relationships. But if not, I guess there's reading material available on that. So yeah.
Yeah. So privacy of things like the self-driving car or the pet is generally not as deep of an area. I haven't thought about that a lot. We've just kind of casually assumed it wasn't a big deal, and that could be wrong. Maybe somebody will tell me more about that. Privacy for a guardian and a dependent is far more interesting and complex. But even with the controllership, there's some subtleties. For example, if a pet goes around disclosing in relationship to a bunch of proxy challenges, if the pet discloses information about their owner over and over again, even though we don't care about the pet's privacy, the owner's privacy may be destroyed. So there's some interesting subtleties to that. And I think a trust framework needs to specify what is the right balance in terms of providing protection for a little girl, but protecting the little girl's privacy and the guardian's privacy. We don't want it to be the case that every time the little girl does anything or any of her guardians do anything, we create a permanent record of it. But on the other hand, given that guardians are in a position of unequal power with respect to their dependent and could be abusing that power, it may be necessary to sacrifice a certain amount of privacy to guarantee oversight. So that's a balance that each trust framework has to strike.
Thank you. Charles is asking if these guardianship credentials are these guardianship credentials being implemented in Hyperledger Aries?
Yes.
Okay.
That would be a good source of information about them. Actually, that's the only place that I know about this being implemented yet, because the Sovereign Guardianship Task Force is kind of assuming, for all the work they've done, that sovereign-style credentials are going to be used, and that means implementation in Hyperledger. But they deliberately designed this so that it could be used with other credentialing systems, and I'm hoping that their thinking is complete enough that if anybody feels the need to implement this in a different credentialing ecosystem, they won't reinvent the concepts. They'll rather take the concepts and simply issue credentials a different way.
Nice. And now I have some comments just that we can action if you want to action them. Will was saying that he's writing a book dedicated to explain what you're talking about for children that are 7 years old. And the name of the book is Alice and Bob in Wonderland.
I love it. I love it already. Can I buy that book?
Yeah, I can put you in touch with them if so you can learn more about it. And I have a number of comments from Peter, and just another question came in. So I'm just going to bring up the comments from Peter. Peter was saying this presentation is opening my mind. We need to be more open to others. We need our help. Thanks a lot, Daniel. He's also saying for us in Europe, he's saying we use the EU IDAS regulation, but we now have a way to make it possible. I think he's referring to the trust framework or governance framework as a reference point. And he's also saying, and thanks so much to the SSI meetup community, and especially to Daniel, big thanks. So just some comments from Peter for you. And then I have a last question from Alan that just came in. If you want, we can answer this one, and then we should be okay.
Sure.
Awesome. And so one weakness in the example was that grandmother Zoe had 0 restrictions on her guardianship. What if instead of 6-year-old Mia was a day or week or month younger than the legal age when Mia and Zoe entered the camp? Shouldn't a guardian always have limits?
Yes, guardians probably should always have limits. One of the limits that you can express is an expiration. I just picked an example that I tried to keep overly simple, and I was trying to contrast the camp, which clearly has some limits, with the grandmother, who probably has some too, but a lot less limits than the camp does. So I just said that she didn't have any in my example. But you're right, a more robust implementation would probably put some limits on the grandmother as well. And so that's a good improvement. That's the kind of thing that the trust framework should actually specify. It should say, no guardians have no limits in our trust framework, because that's too much of a thing for abuse. We're only going to let you have guardianship status if you have one of the following 3 different limit profiles, or whatever. You know, you could say that in a trust framework and provide the kind of protection that you're talking about.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Daniel. I think we took a little bit longer than usual today, but that's great because we had a lot of good questions. Any final comments you would like to share before we close off?
I would just like to say that I'm eager to talk about this subject. It's near and dear to my heart for some personal reasons, and also I think it's technically interesting. So my contact information is there. Feel free to reach out to me if you want to have more conversation.
Awesome. Thank you so much. So everyone, you have the email from Daniel here on the screen, so please reach out to him if you're interested in the subject. Daniel, thank you so much for making time and for sharing all your insights and knowledge about all this. And for everyone else, we will be taking up our next SSI meetup in late August. We'll have some very cool stuff coming up as always. One will be based in a debate that recently happened in Seattle with Drummond Reed and some other members of the SSI community in Seattle. So we will be doing one of those late August, and many other ones I'm preparing right now. So I'm working on all that. Thank you all for joining us today. If you want to learn more about what we're doing in the coming time, please just sign up to the newsletter on the website, Telegram group, Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, all those channels where you can be updated, whatever's best for you. And thank you for joining us today. And thank you, Daniel, for making time. It was a pleasure to have you again with us. And I'll look forward to have you many more times in the future, because I know there are many other subjects in the SSI space that you can cover really well.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks.